Hello, my name is Grandin Gill, and I'm a professor in the Information Systems and Decision Sciences Department of the College of Business of the University of South Florida. And I'm preparing this video just to give students a little bit idea of what it's like to prepare for a case competition. And we're doing this specifically in honor of the first local case competition that our department is running. We've modeled our departmental case competitions after the type of case competitions we've seen on the national and international scene. And so as a result, we start with a discussion case that has not been widely published so that no student has an advantage over other students. And I talk a little bit about what a discussion case is in a companion video about analyzing your first case. Uh, Groups are then formed prior to the competition so that everyone is ready once the case is delivered, usually about a week before the competition begins. By the way, at the point where the case is delivered, the faculty member is not allowed to talk with the students at all in the course of the competition. And there have been some problems in some national and international competitions where faculty coaches became heavily involved in prepping the students after the students got the cases. We will simply not do that at the University of South Florida. Then finally, the groups analyze the cases and will typically present for around 20 minutes or so, and after which they'll get some feedback from the judges. And for some of the larger competitions, you will often find that there are several rounds. And so one of the first objectives that you need to achieve is to get into the finals. Discussion cases, which are the type of cases that are almost always used in these competitions, are nearly always modeled around a decision that needs to be made. And one of the first things you need to look at when you're analyzing a case is what type of decision you're looking at. And there's a spectrum of decision types that you might find in a case. And on the one extreme, they range from decisions where you are given all the alternatives. And in those types of cases, your real focus is to create a strong logical argument for one of the alternatives in particular, while recognizing the pros and cons of the other potential alternatives. Now, at the other extreme, you will sometimes get cases that give you no direction whatsoever with respect to what alternatives might be available. In those cases, you have to devise your own alternatives. And those cases tend to require a more advanced knowledge of the industry. You'll tend to see more cases like that at the master's level, for example, than the undergraduate level. But they provide an opportunity for being significantly creative. Now, as I mentioned, this is not two distinct points, rather, it's a spectrum. Very often, when you're given a set of alternatives, an unspoken or sometimes spoken alternative is to come up with some other plan. And it probably makes sense to investigate that possibility fairly carefully if you conclude that none of the alternatives you've been given are very good. And very often you will need to come up with an alternative that is not a compromise between alternatives. Very often compromises between alternatives are worse than either alternative. It's kind of like when you're creating a recipe, and if you couldn't decide between roast lamb and angel food cake, a good solution would not be to combine the ingredients of both into one recipe. But sometimes you really can benefit by thinking outside the box. And that's one opportunity that you may see in a case competition. And if you see that type of opportunity, I encourage you to take it because chances are that will distinguish you from others in the competition. Now, if you've got a pure design case, everybody's going to be coming up with out of the box alternatives since that is pretty much what the case requires. And if the case doesn't allow you to choose between alternatives, then you have to really stick with that as well. So what's the protocol for preparing for a case discussion? Well, what I recommend is that The groups start out with everyone working individually, and of course, the first thing everyone needs to do is to read the case. Now, once you've read the case, to get kind of the big picture, and what's most important here is trying to figure out the nature of the decisions that need to be made in order to prepare your presentation, then the next thing you want to do is you want to look at the details of the case. And the details are very important because for the most part, in case competitions, they are not necessarily looking for huge amounts of outside research on the case. They want you to use the facts in the case as your primary source. Normally, they won't prevent you from going out and doing outside research, but you first want to make sure you understand everything that's been in the case and are aware of the details. Then it's very, very important that you actually do some thinking about the case and reflecting on the case. And while later on the group is going to get involved with the process of coming up with solutions, I think it's very beneficial to have each individual in the group come up with their own thoughts, their own solutions, write them down. So when it's time to meet, everybody can provide a contribution, because having a diverse groups of thoughts going into the case is one of the biggest advantages you can have in preparing a case. Finally, one of the things you need to do in your own mind is sort out what details are important and what details are less important. Discussion cases tend to be long. They're often 20 to 30 pages long, including exhibits. They include a lot of details that you don't need to know to make a sensible decision. And that's the real world, because in the real world, there's no roadmap regarding what is valid and what is not valid in terms of making a decision. You as a manager have to make that choice. So, as a consequence, it's really important to decide which of the many details in a case are the one that you're going to focus your presentation around. Now, once everyone's worked at the individual level, it's time to get together as a group. And the first thing I recommend is just brainstorming. Everybody's coming in now with their own analysis of the case. Give everybody a chance to talk and then just bounce ideas around. Especially in a large case competition, you will never succeed by doing exactly what everyone else is doing. So what you need to do is you need to come up with some special spin that distinguishes your group from other groups. Now, once you've done the brainstorming, then it's time to put the pieces together and try and come up with a kind of a logical framework for analyzing the case. And that logical framework is going to be the thrust of your presentation. And if you've got a strong presentation goal, a strong presentation organization, that is going to be a huge advantage to you as you compete with other groups. Finally, it's time to prepare the actual presentation itself. And a good presentation given in a clear and effective manner is going to be a huge advantage in these competitions. Often it is the presenting skills of the participants that is the deciding factor for the judges. So one of the most important things that you're going to have to think about when you're preparing for a case competition is the nature of the recommendation that you give. And this is a place where you can get a real advantage over your competitors, but doing so requires that you take some risks. And let me just sort of explain. Uh, you know, Imagine that the possible combinations that you might recommend for the organization, combinations of strategy, people, how you implement these things, each comes with a certain ranking. And and this takes a lot of imagination. Just imagine that we can visualize these rankings as kind of a mountainous landscape where the higher the position, the better the recommendation is likely to succeed. Well, the case itself is going to give you a starting point. And from that starting point, you have to decide how far your recommendation is going to take you away from where the organization already is. Now, one approach, And this approach probably makes sense if the organization seems like it's in really good shape and it doesn't appear to have any serious threats to its existence. What you may choose is an incremental approach. The incremental approach essentially involves a solution that's pretty similar to the status quo. Maybe it involves a little bit of motion, maybe to another nearby peak. But the idea is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, this is a very conservative approach, and one of the things you can pretty much guarantee is that most of the groups in any case competition will take this conservative approach if it's open to them. Now, there's another way you might do this, and this other way involves what I would call a transformative approach. And in the transformative approach, what you're doing is you're suggesting a fairly radical change to the organization. And radical change means that you're going to have to go through some valleys in order to get to the peaks. Think about a golf swing. If you're a golfer or a baseball player or pretty much in any sport, and you are taught a new technique, when you first start using that new technique, your skill level is going to decline or your performance is going to decline. But in the long run, if it's a good technique, your performance will eventually get substantially better than what it started out to be. And that's the idea of transformative change. One of the things that I would recommend is if you're in a case competition where some of the judges are from the organization, what I have found is that people from the organizations are often substantially more enthusiastic about radical recommendations than the faculty members who might be judging these competitions. The faculty members tend to like to play it safe and they don't like to embarrass themselves by siding with a recommendation that actually has a bunch of things wrong with it if you look in detail. But a lot of times the folks from the organization where the case was initially created like the notion of people thinking outside the box, because one of the great challenges in business is getting your employees to be willing to take risks and be willing to think far outside the status quo. And so my recommendation would be if you know you're going to have a bunch of people from the organization as part of the judges and you really want to distinguish yourself in the competition, think about transformative recommendations and see if any make sense. What you don't want to do, of course, is make a recommendation that doesn't make sense. That's just a very bad idea. So when it comes time to create your presentations, what do the best presentations tend to look like? Well, the first thing is that the best presentations, and this is by far the most important thing, emphasize the decision to be made. There is a very, very strong tendency among students in particular to try to avoid committing themselves to a particular decision and instead focusing on providing all the details of the case. Well, particularly if you've got managers from the organization on the judging team, but even if you've got faculty on the judging team, you can assume they all know the details of the case. You don't need to tell them those details. What they're looking for is for you to extract those details relevant to the decision. So never stray too far away from that decision. Now, another thing that I often see in student presentations is they try to keep the audience in suspense about what they're going to recommend. Now, part of this is kind of a defensive strategy. Well, look, I don't want to recommend the wrong thing. So first I want to give all my reasons for the recommendation before making the recommendation, because that way they won't think I'm foolish. Well, the problem is a presentation in a case competition is not a mystery novel. People don't appreciate being in suspense, and particularly if you're going to make a radical recommendation, you'll get their attention very quickly if you make the radical recommendation, and then if you can put together a case as to why that recommendation makes sense, you're going to have all the judges on your side. The same is true for a conservative recommendation, but for a conservative recommendation, a lot of times the reasons you're supporting it are fairly obvious from the case, and then they're just looking at your ability to put together a good argument. Now, another thing that you want to do in your presentations is you want to highlight the key points that you're going to be talking about, but you do not want to tell the whole story uh, in your slides. The slides are there for two reasons. They help the audience figure out the organization behind your presentation, and they help you remember where your presentation is so that you're not digressing. But do not turn the presentation into a complete story. Now, I've seen that done in certain case competitions, and I've seen it done in winning presentations, but in a real world, you'd be providing the slides to the company, you'd be providing them a written report that provides the details. The big thing you're focused on in making a presentation is keeping that audience alert and engaged. And you can't do that if they read the slide in 30 seconds and then you're spending the next 2.5 minutes talking about it. Finally, I recommend using graphics in place of text wherever possible. Bullet points are sometimes necessary, but if you create an entire presentation using bullet points, it can get very, very boring, and it's also extremely familiar. It's a very conservative approach. One thing I encourage is whenever you're trying to figure out how to make a point, look at the smart art in PowerPoint and see if there's some diagrammatic form that could help you make that point without turning it into bullet points. For example, this slide could have easily been bullet points, but I decided to use something a little different. Not that the triangles really mean anything, but they just create a little bit of visual interest. Please don't read your slides. Whatever you do, don't compose slides with the intent of reading from them. That is far worse than stumbling a bit in your presentation. Not only does it put your audience to sleep, it also tends to make you present in a monotone, removing all emotion and interest from the presentation, as I think I am making clear. Enough said. So just to repeat a little bit from my video on case analysis, the best analyses of case studies focus on the decisions that need to be made. I mean, this is absolutely critical. It is so easy to focus on telling the history of the company, on telling about the participants, on describing the industry, and understanding all those things is very important in your analysis, but never wander away from the decision and how these important inputs to the decision help determine what makes sense to do and what does not make sense to do. The best analyses build heavily on the facts in the case. In a case competition in particular, the expectation is that most of your facts are going to be coming out of the case study itself. If you want to do external research, that's fine. Forrester reports and the Gartner Group are available at the USF library. This is a wonderful resource if you want to do some analysis of your own. And if you've got the time, there's nothing wrong with doing some spot checking of what's in the case using those other sources. But ultimately, you're going to be judged on how effectively you use what's in the case as part of your arguments. Now, another important thing is that you make sensible assumptions. Every case study is a simplification of the real world situation. Real world situations, for the most part, cannot be described in a case. In fact, they can't be fully described in a book. There are just too many factors in play in the real world. So as a consequence, there are always going to be some blanks that you need to fill in. Just understand what your assumptions are and recognize that sometimes even very slight differences can have a huge impact on what your recommendation is. For example, if you're dealing with a case study about an entrepreneur, if the entrepreneur is getting bored with the business, the likely alternatives are all going to involve selling the business or in some way disposing of it, regardless of what the business logic is. So that one little factor could totally transform what makes a sensible recommendation. And what you need to do if you make assumptions is, first off, have them very clearly stated so that if you're questioned by a judge about your assumption, you can explain A, what the assumption is, and B, why you made it. And then uh, you can make your judgment based upon those assumptions. And then finally, and this is another very common trait among people doing case studies, don't hedge your bet with the case study. And by hedging your bet, I mean failing to make a decision. In other words, you've got a bunch of choices, but you're not going to recommend one because you are afraid of being wrong. And by the way, that's a common failure among managers. They have a much greater fear of being wrong than expected reward from being right. And so, as a consequence, it's easy not to make a choice for fear it's the wrong choice. That's not going to win you a case competition. Another thing is, don't try to create multiple recommendations that are sort of inconsistent with each other so as to confuse the judges and make it possible for them to think you're right even when you haven't been very clear. Now, you want a clear recommendation. And remember, if you've got two extremes, a compromise is not always the best thing. Say you want to go skiing in Aspen and your wife wants to go to Miami for a beach vacation. Well, the compromise between that two, the halfway point, is Texarkana, Texas. So is that where you're going to go? Because that's the closest thing to a compromise, at least geographically. So the point is that sometimes you have to choose between the alternatives and don't try to compromise where it doesn't make sense. And then finally, there is the recommendation, oh, well, we need to hire a consultant to gather more data. Generally, this is not a good recommendation. You know, the case gives you the information you've got, and in the real world, you have to deal with imperfect information. Now, sometimes in a case, there will be a clear need for a specific piece of data. And if that is the case, then what you need to do is you need to recommend a very specific course of action as to how to get that data. I have one case where that's the case. You simply cannot make a decision unless you know one piece of information. So the key recommendation is to take action that will get you the information you need. But that's different from saying, well, we need more information. You really, if you're going to recommend information gathering as a strategy, you have got to be very specific about how you're going to go out and get the information. And if you have to be pretty sure that this is going to give you the information you want. Otherwise, it's going to be viewed as a hedge, and that will count against you.